when you think of personality traits, I don't think of them as like entities, as things. Like you're not going to find narcissism in the brain or anything like that. One way I think of this almost like a constellation of traits that kind of hold together, more or less. Um, well, the traits are one way to think of this is there are what you might call two flavors of narcissism, two expressions of narcissism that we typically refer to as grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. And and the sort of the core trait that holds grandiose and vulnerable narcissism together, that connects them, is called self-centered antagonism. That basically vulnerable and grandiose narcissism are both associated with in terms of big five personality, we're talking about low agreeableness. These are people, they not only will respond aggressively to insults or perceived insults, but they also are sort of proactively aggressive towards others. They will they don't hesitate to say and do things that upset other people. They're relatively unconcerned with other people, at least in terms of like offending them, things like that. So they tend to have a lot of interpersonal problems with people. That's a big a big correlate of both grandiose and vulnerable narcissists. They have problems with other people. Okay, so that antagonism is really a hallmark feature of all narcissism, including grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. And then you might call these specifier traits. So these are traits that sort of distinguish grandiose or vulnerable narcissism. With grandiose narcissism, you have what's called agentic extroversion, and basically, grandiose narcissists they're socially outgoing, they're socially bold, they're confident, they're extroverted, but they are extroverted in a way where everything is really about them. It's about drawing attention to themselves. So one way to think of this is so you have what's called agency and communion. And like agentic traits are traits that sort of distinguish you from other people. These would be like intelligence, beauty, things that that people are different on. And then you have communal traits, which are traits that sort of bring people together: kindness, compassionate, and narcissist extroversion is really a strongly agentic form of this. They are not like outgoing, bringing people together, working with charities, things like that. Everything is about drawing attention to themselves and gaining admiration from other people. And then with vulnerable narcissism, you have a specifier trait called narcissistic neuroticism. And really vulnerable narcissism, the key feature there is neuroticism. These folks are anxious. They're anxious. They can even be depressed. They tend to worry a lot about what other people are thinking about them, whether they're being respected enough, stuff like that. Grandiose narcissism is really, as the name implies, it's really about this. It's this grandiose self-concept. Vulnerable narcissism, they really more, they struggle a lot more with their self-concept. It's kind of like they really strongly desire to be admired, but they don't feel like they get it ever enough, and so they're much more likely to have like anxiety disorders, depression. Whereas grandiose narcissists are actually kind of the opposite. They tend to be less anxious than average. They tend to be less depressed than average. So that's sort of like narcissism. And then underneath narcissism, you have grandiose and vulnerable expressions. And then underneath that, you have these three traits: that self-centered antagonism, agentic extroversion, and narcissistic neuroticism. Yeah, so the trait theory of NPD is basically that you have these narcissistic personality, and NPD is when it becomes a problem, when it starts creating a lot of dysfunction. And there's ample ways that both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism can create problems for people. Problems tend to be a little different. Vulnerable narcissism, the problems tend to be more intrapersonal, like depression, anxiety. Where grandiose narcissism tends to be more interpersonal. They have conflicts, things like that. They have trouble holding relationships together. But they're both lots of opportunities for problems. But with grandiose narcissism, there definitely is. And you can actually kind of, sometimes you can find a factor analyses where you'll get like sort of a more or less positive factor and a negative factor. The negative stuff is almost all like interpersonal problems, but intrapersonally, it is positive. They do like themselves. In fact, my advisor, Keith Campbell, he used to write like, if you just strip the label narcissism from this construct and you told parents like, your kid's they're gonna think highly of themselves, they're gonna think they're smart, they're gonna think they're good looking, they're gonna think they're talented, and yeah, they may have some problems, they may have the occasional problems with people and stuff. He's like, I bet you a lot of parents would love to make, even if you just look at narcissism, let's say you just talk about narcissism as like a total score. And so I have some research showing that that basically on lower scores of narcissism, it's primarily like a good thing. It's really associated with self-esteem, lower depression, lower anxiety. And it's kind of like once you get to like sort of almost near the midpoint of the scale, that's when it starts getting into all the negative interpersonal stuff. So that's when it starts correlating with things like psychopathy, aggression, stuff like that. So there almost is like, even with a total score, I've talked about it as like maybe like an optimal narcissism. On average, people think they're like the 75th percentile on most like traits that they find important. So everyone is like, in fact, positive illusions are like a feature of like good psychological health. So everyone's kind of like this. The leading theories right now are that basically it comes from like essentially good parenting kind of run amok. And it's sort of like you're overvaluing your children. There's a guy named Eddie Brummelman who does a lot of this research out in the Netherlands, and he talks about this overvaluation concept. And it really does appear to be mostly from that, rather than the old psychodynamic views where they came from like parental harm and abuse and stuff. And that may be more of a vulnerable narcissism thing, but in terms of grandiose narcissism, it really does appears to be more like your parents, they almost sort of think too highly of you, and they never correct you, and and then really importantly, they really stress agentic things. So they really stress in their children, like, you need to be better than these other kids. Like I always use the example of like my kids playing soccer. And like, you have some parents who are just super about like, you need to score more goals, you need to do this. That's focusing on these agentic traits. As a narcissism researcher, I try to do the opposite with my kids and focus on like, that was a great pass you made to your friend. Like, you were a really good teammate there, stressing the communal things. But yeah, I think when you sort of combine overvaluation and an agentic mindset, that's kind of how you get people like Donald Trump. You get this grandiose narcissism. But because it is like, it's generally speaking, like a lot of it's pretty good parenting. It's just sort of like, I don't know, it's just sort of to the extreme maybe. And of course combined with genetic vulnerabilities and things like that. But because it's a lot of it's decent parenting, you could imagine like, well, you could also do that and maybe not create like a full-blown narcissistic kid who doesn't care about other people. You do have this, alternative perspective called the dynamic theory. The dynamic perspective suggests that vulnerable narcissism is really the core of narcissism and NPD, and and that without that, you really don't have it. You don't have narcissism. What you have is somebody who's maybe dominant, things like that, but you don't have narcissism. Will oscillate between grandiose and vulnerable expressions. And so that's what it gets the name dynamic perspective. There's this dynamic, this oscillation going back and forth. The research there, it's hard to study that. To do it, you got to do like lots of measures like per day, and so it's really hard to study that. There was a recent dissertation that was just done. One of Aidan Wright's students did a dissertation on this, and they found some tantalizing evidence that people who are mostly grandiose in their narcissism occasionally experience some moments of vulnerability. They didn't find any evidence that people who are vulnerable experience moments of grandiosity. That seems to be more stable. And so there has long been this idea that narcissists, like, sort of this deep down inside, it's a facade. It's called the mask model of narcissism, where once you take off the mask, you'd see that they don't really think anything like this, and they will deep-seated problems. And one of the ways that's supposed to manifest is in terms of self-esteem fluctuations. And you might think of that as like problems with regulating self-esteem. I don't think Donald Trump gets mad about things. I think he feels like he's mistreated. I think he feels like that people are unfair to him. And I mean, imagine like if I don't know, like, I mean, you're not a narcissist, but like someone just like is saying like, oh, Hannah's like really, really terrible at this. And you're like, no, I'm not. And you're like, no, she's terrible at, like, you'd be probably furious too. And stuff. Now, Trump is super narcissistic. In fact, he's like kind of the exemplar. I've never seen anyone in my life he makes me more confident in narcissistic theories. He exhibits them so clearly, everything he does. In fact, I regularly just like, oh my God, that thing that we talked about in literature, that's actually, he's doing it right now. So he's just like crazy narcissistic. But still, I think his perceptions is that he really believes he's that good, and it really angers him when people don't respect him. And so, yeah, but I don't think who knows? I mean, who knows? Maybe he has his moments. I'm sure everyone's capable of having their moments where they wonder. But I think by and large, he's pretty confident in himself. And it shows in his behaviors, right? I mean, the guy never changes anything. He never adjusts. If he was really concerned, you would probably see he would back down from things. He would adjust his strategies. He doesn't do anything like that. In fact, he sort of shows the classic, that sort of rigidity you get with personality disorders. And so yeah, I don't think he's crying himself to sleep. I think he's yelling himself to sleep at night.